I don't think it's so much that kids are little scientists. I think it's that scientists are big kids. It's a natural human activity to explore, to try to understand, and that's a natural human activity because that's what we're like as kids. That's how come we become scientists. Because I'm a developmental psychologist, and kids grow up to be adults. And part of what we want to understand in all this is how we become who we are. And who are we? Because who we are is partly defined by ourselves as kids and how we got there. We're the products of our developmental history. We're a species that has a really, really long period of immaturity in which to develop a protected juvenility. I think that part of that is because we're a species that really privileges learning.
How to Science, a podcast from the College of Literature, Science, and the Arts at the University of Michigan, Season 2. With podcast host, LSA Professor Monica Duz. This is me. The theme of the season is How to Science in Society. Season 2 explores the lives of scientists. We're interested in figuring out who are scientists, but also what it's like to do science in the context of a bigger society. After this story, I'll be back with a Q&A with the guest to talk more about how to science in society. Take a look through someone else's safety goggles.
I'm Henry Wellman, and I'm a professor in the Department of Psychology. I've been here at Michigan for 40 years. For all those 40 years, I've been interested in sort of the same question, and it is, how do children think? After I graduated from college for a couple of years, I was a kindergarten and a preschool teacher. So in a preschool classroom with 4-year-olds, then I was helping this 4-year-old boy put his shoes on. And I said one of those kind of things that adults often say. I said, oh, wow, your mom's going to have to get you some new shoes soon because you're getting so big. And then the child sort of paused and looked at me and he said, no, your feet don't get any bigger. And I said, how does that go? And then he said, well, you drink your milk and it comes out in your pee and it never reaches your feet. And this, I thought, was great. It's great for two reasons. First of all, it shows that children and adults don't think alike. But more importantly, it shows that children aren't just ignorant. They're not just empty of ideas. They have their own ideas. They think differently. And that their thoughts are oftentimes revealing of kind of internal theories they have about how the world works in certain sorts of ways. In this case, how kind of nutrition biology kind of works. You eat stuff, it goes inside you, it gets transformed in certain ways, it gives you growth, it gives you energy and stuff like that. Now, it was a very sensible, after I asked a few more questions, a pretty sensible set of answers that this kid had, and they were coherent in certain kinds of ways. And that fascinated me. Why are kids thinking like this, and what are they thinking? How does that change with age? How does that develop? We've done studies on that, but children form naive theories about naive biology, but also about physics, the world of objects and forces and how they work, and also naive psychology. How do people work, and why do they do what they do and say what they say? And so a lot of our research, we bring kids into the lab, set up experiments to try to help reveal their thoughts, set up provocative kinds of things so that they might be intrigued to talk about them. We do this with even babies. So in my laboratory over in the psychology department, we do things with kids as young as 6 months old, and then all the way up through 1, 2, 3, 4, 5-year-olds. And as I said, on their understanding about people's insides, their minds. Mostly with babies, we shoot videotape that shows people acting in either ordinary or non-ordinary ways. And one of the things we know about babies is everything else being equal, if you set the situation up right, they like to look at the odd stuff. They like to look at the novel stuff, not the old and familiar stuff. So we record how they look at things. Well, children understand that people are different than objects in lots of different ways. They can engage in actions on their own, spontaneously, in ways that like a rock can't. For a rock to move, it has to be moved. But people actually are objects too. They are physical objects. So in this particular study, the videotape is this woman walking across a big raised platform. And in the ordinary case, to begin with, she walks across it and she knocks on it so that it's clear that it's solid and things like that. And she knocks on the side of it with the fall off, the cliff part of the end of this big platform, so it's clear that's solid too. And her fist goes right through the air, so it's clear that's just air there. Anyway, and so then after that setup, the woman walks to the end of the platform, stops. Pretty routine, ordinary, if you understand things like gravity and solidity and support, and that people are objects like that. And then in the extraordinary event or the unusual event, she walks to the end of the platform and just keeps walking straight off and floats in the air. We just filmed this with green screen. And babies think that's really weird. So they watch that one a lot, and a lot more than the other ones. And they'll watch that a lot more than one where she walks off to the end, and so she then steps down onto the... So babies understand that people are special. They're not just ordinary physical kinds of objects. They are propelled by different forces inside them, forces like their desires and their beliefs and things like that. But that's not to say that they're not objects. They can't defy gravity, just like any other object can't defy gravity. So one of the things we have now is a series of studies on children and robots. Because robots can kind of look like people. They can act on their own too. Do they have minds? What do kids think about that as minds? What do kids think about that as a material device, a machine? Not human, but they may have a mind. How does that either stretch or reveal what they think about? I talked about it at the very beginning as children forming theories, and I think that's exactly what they're doing. They'll surprise you, but they're smart, right? Or they're combinations. They're both sort of wise and witless at the same time, and that figuring that out, that's the fascination. Yeah, all kids are surprising.
I don't have kids, and I typically think of kids like people who will get me sick or get my silk dress dirty. But thinking of science and society, you were a scientist in society when you were a preschool teacher, right? So you literally started...
I didn't realize that. But
right,
yes.
but you literally started studying society. Right?
Sure.
And you got a set of insights that clearly, right, people like me would never think of, would never cross their mind. So clearly that shaped you pretty profoundly. But what things about you do you think set you apart from people that didn't have the experience of being in society with kids, like with 4-year-old kids?
I think pretty much all good science depends on the scientists steeping themselves in their subject matter in ways that aren't just programmatic. Oh, I want to understand about this, so I'm going to look at this one thing. But, keeping your eyes open and kind of understanding how these phenomena work or how they appear and manifest in a wide variety of situations, not just in the lab. I think I was lucky, but it also fueled my scientific fire in that I had all those experiences to begin with that led to the science. I think those two things have to be melded together, and that it's important for a scientist's work, especially if you're going to continue being fascinated and open up new things over 40 years, to bridge those two sorts of things. You can't just stay in the lab. You have to have these other sorts of experiences and try to connect them together. So I would think that would be true for any kind of science. Science and society will manifest itself in different kinds of ways, but it's pretty easy with kids because there they are. They're part of society. They're right out there. They're everywhere. You can sit next to a kid on an airplane sometime. talk with that person. Not
What-
the squeaking babies. I want to sit next to a 4-year-old sometime. You might get fascinated.
When you started your lab, was that an unusual thing to think about? That kids had their own minds and theories and scientific view of the world? Was that a controversial position?
Well, yes and no. Educators oftentimes have some pedagogical kinds of ideas, which are, well, kids just need to be told. They just need to be instructed. They are just kind of empty and ignorant, and so we just have to give them the right kind of ideas. Now, it turns out that that's not very true with, at least at the time, and even now more with people that were interested in early childhood education, kindergarten and preschool kind of teachers. They thought that kids did have their own ideas and they did their own things. They did like play, and you don't have to just teach them this kind of stuff. You have to encourage them to explore the world with play, because they will come to these sorts of ideas somewhat on their own. But still, in American psychology, the largest sort of thrust at the time that I was a graduate student, this is back in the 70s, was more the kind of way you were talking about it. Yeah, let's think about kids as ignorant and how
Black
we're going to
box.
instruct them and stuff like that. Right. I thought the scientists were supposed to certainly base our theories and observations, but we have to do more than observe, right? We have to theorize, and we have to experiment, we have to test, we have to formulate our observations in such a way that they make sense. And sometimes, just like kids, our formulations are going to be wrong, right? We want to test them against the evidence. We want to revise them. We want to be open to all that kind of stuff. But yeah, observation's really important.
You know, we often think of scientists are doing all these aspects, all the work of science in the lab, but in fact, at least in your case, there is a very specific example of the very first step of the scientific method actually occurring in society. So hearing about that, I find that really compelling. And the other thing that I find really compelling about the stories you describe is that in many ways your research is studying the development of society.
My story about kids as scientists and engaging in theory means that they're creating some of this on their own. They're not just absorbing it. And the end product, what kids are like as adults, doesn't mean that they've just bought into the standard story. You know, some kids become rebels, some kids become scientists, some kids say, hey, I don't believe that. I'm going to go off and try to do this other thing instead. Sometimes some of the biggest propellants of societal changes are young people, and that's because they have some sort of protected spaces to do that. You know, they come to university and they explore new ideas and things like that, you know. But sometimes they're just trying to figure it out, and sometimes they're also embarked on a path of trying to get society to change for the better, as they see better. There's a thing called adolescent utopianism. I'm going to create a better world. I got these ideas. That flaw, society's not great. I'm going to make it better.
What about joining our Facebook How to Science podcast group, where you can learn more about science, about how to science, and maybe get to talk to scientists about science news? Join the How to Science Facebook community, where we want to pop the bubble of the lab and see what it's like to do science in society. Make sure you it's a hard word, subscribe. Okay. Subscribe to the podcast. Help your friends find out how to science by giving us a 5-star rating on iTunes. And I honestly can barely pronounce the word algorithm, but something about the iTunes algorithm really helps other people that might never otherwise hear about it find it and listen to it. How to science. How to science. How to science.
The How to Science podcast is recorded at WCBN FM, the student-run, community-supported radio station on the campus of the University of Michigan.
One last thing, just for kicks and giggles. I don't know if that's what you say in English. You're a weirdo.